Welcome back to Whitaker Writings. I'm Jason Cormier. This week we're going to talk about prologues and why you need to write one. All right, let's talk about prologues. This is a very touchy subject for a lot of writers. Readers will choose not to read your book if it contains a prologue, or they'll skip the prologue altogether, making it pointless to even have it in there. Some agents won't even give your manuscript a chance if it has a prologue. There is such a bad stigma out there for prologues, and a lot of it's due to the fact that people don't do them correctly. However, I want you to understand that prologues themselves have a very substantial purpose. And there are some times where a prologue isn't absolutely needed inside your story. So to say that you should or should not include a prologue, especially before you finish writing your manuscript, is just ignorant. You really should write your prologue every single time. Don't worry about whether it goes in your story or your final draft or not. Just write your prologue. And I'm going to explain to you why you should do that today. For starters, if you're not quite familiar with exactly what a prologue is or what it's supposed to do, let me explain. A prologue is basically a chapter that precedes chapter 1. So rather than starting your book from chapter 1 directly in the story, you may start with a prologue, which kind of prefaces your book itself by providing information that the book may not contain or that is very important to the plot or the book's development. Maybe it's something that provides a backstory about one of the characters or even foreshadows an event that's to come. All of these things may be found inside a prologue and may be able to help further along the book or the understanding of the reader before they dive into your world. So there is a point to a prologue, but should you have one in your story? Now that's a whole nother question. Regardless of whether you should or should not include a prologue in your story, you need to write one. Every single time you write a story, I want you to forget whether you should have a prologue or not, or what your feelings are on that, and write one anyway. I know a lot of you are planners, which means that you tend to plan out your entire story before you write. That means that you've already developed the characters. You've probably written bios on them. You've developed the cities and the land, and you've world built, and you've done all these things to get yourself prepared for your story. Outlined the chapters, the details, you know all the key plots and events. And even if you are a pantser and you like to just make that stuff up as you go, you still have a point where you're going to have to edit out information that you realize your reader doesn't need to know. A lot of times when we first write a story, we are creating this fantasy world, especially when it comes to fiction writing. And when we're creating this fantasy world, we don't know all the rules to it. We don't know the details. The characters are completely fabricated, which means we can make them into whatever we want. And we have to get comfortable and familiar with the way those characters interact with themselves, with each other, how they're going to handle certain types of moral decisions they're going to have to make. We also need to know the cities. We need to know the shops. Who are they going to run into and how are they going to react? How are key elements of this story and of the place that they live going to affect our character and the development of our story? Now, these are things that we can discover through a prologue. By not focusing on trying to jump right into what our planned story should start and end, we can actually figure that out as we go. Now that happens by writing. If you ask anybody who's ever been in the military, they'll tell you that the best laid plans usually go to complete shit the moment the first bullet goes flying. And the reason why is because you don't know what's going to happen. Nobody does. It's impossible to plan every aspect of your book. Something's going to be left out. Or maybe you're going to be writing and an idea is going to pop inside your head. Or you may forget something that you said earlier in the book and you counter yourself later on. And then when you go back and you proofread, you're going to decide which aspect you want to go with. Is it the original plan or the secondary one you came up with? One of the best pieces of advice I was ever given was in my very first intro to creative writing class when I started college. And my professor told me this. She said, write the first 4 chapters of your story and then throw out the first 3 and just make chapter 4, chapter 1. Now, that's not always guaranteed to work like that, but it is a great, solid piece of advice. The point of this advice is that sometimes what we think we need to write is not what we need to write. It's what we as a writer need in order to create a story and an understanding of our world and our characters. And most of the time, our readers don't need that information. So we can just take it out of there. And a lot of times we're just building up our story to the actual story that needs to be told. By taking out the first 3 chapters and starting with chapter 4, we're diving straight into the action. And a lot of times that can be a lot more exciting and catch our readers' attention off the rip, rather than starting off by introducing our characters with this really long introduction of who they are, where they come from, their family background, the world they live in, all their moral responses, introducing every one of their friends before we finally get into the point of the story, which is what they are doing, the plot. By writing a prologue, we get a chance to go through our ideas. We get a chance to develop them, to be a little bit more lenient with the way that we react with those characters. And we go back and we read that and we decide, hey, I really like the way this sounds, or I really like the way that this character interacts in this way. And I think this is how I want to keep my story or keep this character throughout the story. Or maybe you want to handle the world building in your prologue, where you develop the entire world. How was it created? How does the magic work in your world? Are there rules? Are there limits? Well, why are there limits? Are there gods or deities in your realm? These are all things that are important for you to develop the world and the rules that your character is going to live in. And if you already have those things written and planned out, it makes it much easier when you're telling the rest of your story. A prologue is a great way to put that. Now, no, you're not going to put all of the information that you develop when you're brain dumping your thought process and world building. That's not going to go in your actual story because it's not needed by your reader. Your reader doesn't need to know how the universe was created because honestly, your character doesn't know how the universe was created. When you decide what information goes in the prologue, one, you need to figure out a few things. Whose perspective are you telling the story from? And that character's perspective, do they know what you're wanting to tell your reader? If they don't know the information at the start of the book, then why do you need to tell your reader the information? Instead, you can allow your reader to learn the information as the character does. And what that's going to do is allow your reader to stay more in touch and get more familiar and comfortable with your character. They're going to be able to relate to them better because they're learning the information as your character does. And their reactions inside are going to be the same as the reactions that you write on the page for your character. And that's a very important relationship to build. If your character isn't relatable and the people reading your book feel that there's a disconnect there, or maybe they know something that your reader doesn't, they get that, they feel your character could be, stupid in a very layman's term. Think about when you watch a horror movie and you hear the creepy sound outside and you know that there's murders going on in the town. And what does the main character do? They get up and they go and investigate. They're by themselves. There's a creepy sound. There's a murderer on the presence and you're screaming at the TV. Just sit on your couch, lock the doors, call the cops, pull out a gun, do something besides walk outside in the dark like a dummy. That's the same feeling you give to your readers when you give them information that your character doesn't know yet. They already know what's going on, and they're just looking at your character like, when are they going to figure this out? And when they do finally figure it out, you're going to be like, well, duh. Another use of a prologue is for foreshadowing, and that personally is my favorite use of the prologue. Foreshadowing is great at building an anticipation within the reader for something that may or may not happen. Now, I'm not fortune telling. There's a difference between fortune telling and foreshadowing. When I'm foreshadowing an event, I'm not going to say specifically what is going to happen. One of my least favorite cop-outs when it comes to a prologue is when the prologue fortune tells by showing you an event that is going to happen. And a lot of times that's very off-putting for a reader. One, because you've now lost all the suspense that you can possibly do to your character throughout your story. Because I know that later on in the story, this specific event is going to happen. You've already shown me it. And because of that, I now am going to be detached from any of the suspenseful things that's going to happen to them. I know they're going to survive. They will make it later on in the story to this other event. Yes, it does build a little bit of anticipation for that event, but you lose a lot of what you could get in anticipation for the remainder of the story. So what do I mean by foreshadowing without fortune telling? Well, I may be able to give hints of something that's to come, like maybe somebody rising to power and you don't quite know whether they're going to make it or not. You may show the events of something that happens not related to your character, but that may affect your character down the road. Now, that would be a great thing that happens. Like, let's say, for instance, people around the world are losing magic. And your character relies heavily on magic, or maybe discovers they have magic. And the whole premise of your book is that they're building their magic, they're building their magic, they're building their magic. And we know from the prologue that some people around the world have been losing their magic, and that's caused them to be in very grave danger. If we know that people with magic are losing their powers and that's putting them in danger, and somehow our character's whole development is about them learning to use these powers, we know that something may happen that takes those powers away and is going to put them in danger. That is going to build a suspense within your reader. And the entire time they're reading your story, they're going to wonder if that situation is going to happen. And you as the writer can play on that situation, which makes it even better for you in your storytelling to hold your reader in suspense and to constantly do those types of foreshadowing that keep your reader drawn to the page, wondering when this crucial thing is going to happen. That doesn't mean you should write a prologue in your story for the purpose of doing that every single time. It's not needed. Okay, it's just a tool that could be useful in your story, but only if it's something that's incredibly important to your plot and your story's development. For instance, in the book series, I Am Number 4. And I personally love the Lorien Legacies, the books. I absolutely hated the movie. They didn't even get the powers right of the characters, but that's going to be a whole nother rant. However, I personally really liked that the book started off by showing one of the characters being hunted and pursued and then killed. And that draws suspense because you know when you go to the point of the story, the actual story of Number 4, that he's being hunted and that there is an immediate danger to him. You don't know when it's going to arrive, but you know that something is chasing after him and his kind, and that he is going to have to face that danger at some point. So it hasn't been fortune told what's going to happen to him, but you know that there's the possibility of something happening. When exactly should you determine whether you put the prologue in your book or not? Well, that shouldn't even be a question if you're not finished with your book. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about whether you need a prologue. Don't worry about what information you should tell your reader. Go ahead and write everything. World build in your first draft. There's nothing wrong with that. You're not turning in your very first draft to the editor. You're not going to turn in your very first draft to an agent. You're not going to do that. And if you are, then that's probably why you're not getting a lot of acceptances. You need to go ahead and write a first draft, and you need to proofread it. You need to go through it and figure out what needs to be in your story and what doesn't need to be in your story. And don't be afraid to chop out a massive amount of information. If you know that you plan on your book being 100,000 words, write 150,000 words, because you're going to cut about a third of it away when you properly edit your manuscript. The reason why is because we find out a lot of times that information that we thought was important was not important to our reader, but important to us as a writer, as part of the development of our world. It's just part of our world building process. So if you're not cutting that information out, you're just bogging your book down with unnecessary information. So in summary, you should write a prologue every single time. Don't worry about whether it goes in your story. Don't worry about whether you're going to actually include it. Just write a prologue. Write everything. Write a brain dump. Who cares about whether it's going to actually be your chapter 1 or not? Who cares if it's going to be 50 pages of a prologue? The point is that you brain dump your information and you figure out where your story is supposed to start. What the most crucial part to start your story in is for the reader, so that way they can get into the actual plot and development rather than being tied down with a bunch of boring information. And from there, we can decide whether it's crucial for our story's development to include a prologue and why we need to have it in there. But before I go, I do want to make sure that you understand that a prologue should not be a full chapter. It should not be the size of a chapter or bigger. And if that's the case and you feel that you have all this information that does not fit within your book, that is so crucial to your book that it has to be in a prologue, then you probably need to double check the scope of your story or maybe the perspective at which you're telling the story from. Now, I'd love to know your perspective on prologues and write it in the comments below. I mean, the best way for us to learn about these things and to understand them is for us to debate. If you have a different opinion about writing a prologue than I do, then please put it below. Write a comment so that we as a writer community can talk amongst each other and figure out different strategies for writing. That can only help others and ourselves at writing. And I don't believe that my opinions are perfect. They're just based upon the experiences that I've had in both reading and writing. Now, if you like this content and you'd like to see more from me, please hit the subscribe button below so that way you'll be notified each time I post a video. We should be posting videos every Monday. You can expect to see some type of video involving educated content about writing and or publishing. If you'd like to know more information about myself or my current works in progress, feel free to click the links below, and I may post an update video every now and then, and that'll be in addition to my weekly videos. Again, I appreciate you guys hanging out with me here today and listening to this long rant about prologues. I hope that you got something useful out of this information and it helps you out, and I'll see you in next week's video. Drink lots of coffee, write lots of words. What can I say about prologues? If you're wondering why coffee is so important when shooting a video, if I stumble on my words or I lose my train of thought, I just sip on my coffee a few times and wait for it to come back. That's a hint for all you people out there trying to get into video shooting. Works. Coffee, it's a miracle drug.